Oh, I still have Clifford up. I will get rid of that to be less distracting. But welcome to the coffee hour session of today's workshop. So this is room A, which means that you are here to join us for Nestor de Buen Alatorre's A Semantic Ontology of Rights. So welcome, Nestor. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, hello. Can you all hear me? Okay, it's working. All right, perfect. So, well, I don't know where to start, but I'm really happy to be here. This is the first time I'm presenting anything ever, so this is like really great for me, even if it's
all the more welcome to you. Thanks for taking a chance on us.
Thanks. All right, so how should I start? Well, I guess the idea behind the paper in progress extended abstract, whatever it is at this point, is there's always the question of whether rights are real or not, and then if they're real, then which rights exist and which ones don't, right? So to use a very like politics related example, do people have a right to healthcare, or do people have a right to keep their money and not pay taxes for other people's healthcare, right? So, well, I'm sorry, I'm really bad at presenting, even if I've been preparing. But so I found this idea in Joel Feinberg's The Nature and Value of Rights, which basically says, well, a right is a claim that you hold against someone else, and a right has a correlated duty to the people you hold that right against, for them to do the thing that is your right. And so then he gives a very extended example of this place called Nowheresville, where people don't have a notion of what rights are. And then the idea is to try to say, well, people can be like good people, and they could even have a sense of say, general duty to do good. But if you don't have the idea of rights, then you can have the notion that that you have been wronged. That so, like, for example, if someone injures you, unless you have the notion of a right to, let's say, bodily integrity, then you couldn't say, well, this thing that just happened to me is wrong, and that person shouldn't have done that, and then I am, I don't know, entitled to compensation or something along those lines. But then he has this idea that rights are only claims that you can hold against someone and not more, let's say, positive claims, like I have a claim to something, like I have a claim to a decent life, right? Because a claim to a decent life is it's not a claim that you um that you can directly hold against someone, which then implies that someone else has a duty to give you that decent life, right? um so I guess my basic idea is, if you take the first part seriously, the part about um, you need the idea of rights in order for um, in order to have the notion of having been wronged, then um, then you can't take rights solely as claims against someone, right? Like um, because if what is important is that you are not being wronged, then surely you should be able to say, um, well, if I don't have a minimally decent standard of life, or you know, then I am being wronged, even if there is no one in particular that is, you know, wronging me, right? Um, so then, I'm sorry, I really, like, even in grad school, I was like really bad at presenting my papers, but sorry.
You're good, dude. We're just chill here, talking about your stuff.
Thanks. Um, but yeah, so okay, then the point is, like, if what is important is whether someone is being wronged or not, then um all of that is just like a um it's all basically a statement based on some higher moral principle, right? um so it kind of assumes that there is some higher moral principle that you can invoke um to say what rights are. um so in that sense, there's like the deeper question of, well, what is the one correct moral principle that exists? But like that's a much, uh, I guess, I don't know, like a much deeper question, right? um that I'm not trying to answer. So instead, what I'm trying to say is, okay, if we assume there is one correct moral principle that exists, whatever that may be, then you can always translate that one correct moral principle into a language of rights. And that is, even if you're thinking about kinds of moral philosophy that are usually thought to be opposed to rights, like, say, utilitarianism, which um, you know like, the point is not each person's individual, at least if you're like a very purist kind of Benthamite utilitarian, you might believe, for example, in legal rights, but there are no actual moral rights, right? What matters is the greatest happiness of the um, greatest possible number in the aggregate, rather than um, some notion of individual dignity. But um, and then that's where sorry, I think this is all being very convoluted, but well, anyway, so that's where I think that one can think even in terms of these things, in terms of like similarly to like Carnap's sort of general ontology about things and numbers and classes, which are basically um, like they are real if you accept a linguistic framework in which they exist. So numbers are real if you accept the linguistic framework of mathematics, in which, if you accept the linguistic framework of mathematics, then asking whether there are numbers is trivial because they obviously exist. But if you want to ask like the metaphysical question of like, are numbers real, then you can't prove it, and like that's that kind of nonsensical question, right? um so what I'm saying is, I mean, you don't have to accept um that as a general ontology for everything, but I think in the case of rights, it's very appropriate, um because, well, unless like the world of things, for example, which you could go and very sort of like, you could be very hardcore realist about it and say, here's one hand, here's the other, therefore there's an external world. You can do the same thing with rights, right? With rights, you always need to have um, some kind of metaphysical justification, or and then in that sense, I think rights always do exist in some, in like this kind of framework, um like within their own, I guess, moral framework. And then, but then, so um to use an example of, like with utilitarianism, which is usually not like, utilitarianism is not usually about rights, but you could always reframe it in a way that it gives you something like that looks like rights. So for example, you can always say, um like, let's say there's a given state of utility in society, and then there's one person whose if whose I don't know, like marginal utility is the highest. So if you increase that person's utility, you have the most. That's how you increase social utility overall the most. So in that case, you can always say, um, everyone has a right to have their utility increased if and only if that person has at that moment in time the highest marginal utility, right? Or if you're like an act utilitarian, you could also say, well, if person A has two choices to act, and one act will increase the utility of the other person the most, then under utilitarianism, that person is obligated to take that course of action that will increase that um, person's utility the most. But then you could always just say, well, the second person has the right against the first person to act in such and such a way. And yeah, I mean, with things like this, it's more complicated, probably. Like, it's probably unnecessarily complicated to reframe utilitarianism as rights. But I guess my point is that you can do it. And so I guess, yeah, Uh, I guess I'll leave it at that. It's like the general idea is rights are like uh, rights are like a linguistic way to reframe an overall moral principle if it's correct. And yeah, sorry for the convoluted presentation. I hope it was somewhat clear.
Oh, it was awesome. If it's okay, I'm actually gonna ask the first question because yeah, it's like very much on this sort of just like trying to get the basic idea on the table.
Mhm.
So and if like we're a small group, so as long as we're not like talking over each other, feel free. I guess modeled this by putting up my hand, but you don't have to do that. You can just sort of like chime in if you want. This session is supposed to be like sort of like chill. But I just wanted to get like a little bit of clarification from you, like that I like just to make sure I knew that I was tracking. So is the idea, because I could see like two versions of an idea in a neighborhood. One is that like the idea of rights, like if you are like a committed utilitarian and utilitarianism is true. That like rights could be like a useful fiction that even from within the game of utilitarianism, like within the linguistic framework, we like acknowledge that it's a fiction, but it's like useful nonetheless because it's like a heuristic that can help us like capture somewhat like what we accept as moral truths. Um, that would be separate from like there in fact being rights. It's just that rights get the way that like the sort of metaphysical status gets cashed out within the sort of language of utilitarianism is different than how it would in a different linguistic moral framework. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, that makes sense. And so I would say it's more like the second version that you just presented. Um, because like I guess how do I put this? Well, in a sense, I guess I don't see the two as being entirely different. Um, because maybe this is a bad example, and if it is, I'll try to look for another one. But I don't know how many philosophers of science are there here. Um, but for example, in physics, you have Newtonian mechanics, right? Which is like the familiar framing of physics. Um, but then you can pretty much reframe everything in physics um, as Lagrangian mechanics, and it gives you the same results. It just, and maybe I'm butchering this, but like I think the principle of Lagrangian mechanics is kind of based on like least action. Um, so I mean, it's two kind of different framings of the same thing that gets you at the same result, uh, and they're like functionally equivalent. Um, but I guess there's like conceptually, there's no way of saying like one is more real than the other. Um, so um, like does that make sense? I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly. Yep.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks. Uh, it seems like I think we've got a couple thoughts on this vibe. So Jeffrey, you want to jump in first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Nestor, for the talk and for the really fruitful way to think about rights as an interpretive framework, especially as bounded to language. I think there's a lot of fascinating work there, and so I'm going to approach this from like a Phil of Lang kind of thing.
Oh. Mhm.
So when I'm thinking about rights as an interpretive framework, at least as a linguistically bonded sort of thing, right?
Mhm.
That seems to put rights in the character, and I'm just going to look to Austin's sort of Austinian framework here. We don't have to be subscribed to Austin here, but I'm
Mhm.
using this because it's an easy thing to sort of present. It seems like rights, if we're going with a sort of semantic ontology of it, begin to resemble exercitives. Like there's something about, and there's an exercitive quality. So an exercitive here is a speech act that sets a
Mhm.
rule, right? And you
Right.
have to be in the right, in the sort of right position, and in order for it to be felicitous, you actually have to have that kind of
Wait,
institutional power.
sorry.
Yeah,
Can,
go ahead.
just So it's the thing is, I came into philosophy sort of very like windedly. So like, for example, I have very little idea about, for example, Austin and philosophy of language in general.
Okay.
But I'm just like, my question is, um, a speech act is it literally speech, or is just like, any kind of sentence proposition?
So what we get in How to Do Things with Words, he's usually talking about literally the act of
Oh,
speech.
okay, okay, okay.
So we're not
Yeah,
talking about like logical propositions, P if
right.
P then Q. Um, so when we're talking about exercitives, right, like the example used in How to Do Things with Words is was it a university president who is saying, no loud music after 11 p.m. And because it's the university president endowed with that institutional power,
Mhm.
it's going to work. It's felicitous, as he puts it, right? And it seems like, and likewise, to do the counterexample, if a student were to say no loud music after 11 p.m. for the whole university, it's not going to work because they don't have that kind of
Right,
power.
right.
So, and I think like thinking of rights as an exercitive framework, I think that's pretty interesting because what that means is that you get a kind of meta ethical kind of deal, or possibly,
Mhm.
maybe it's not an inevitability here, but like there's a possible meta ethical move you can make here where all of a sudden you get a frame of, well, if I'm working within a normative system that is hostile to the conception of right, like utilitarianism, um, we still have like these sort of exercitive boundaries that function very much like rights, but don't share the same constitutive character. I think there are some Rawlsian scholars who
Mhm.
want to make that move too. So I think you're onto something here. So I wanted to say that, and thank you very much for working through this with us. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Stephen, you want to drop in?
Yeah, sure. Nestor, thank you so much for the talk. This is really interesting. So, first, I just wanted to follow up on the Lagrangian mechanics example you used when you were answering Jen's question. I'm not sure I understood quite what you were getting at, and maybe it's just a function of me getting too hyper literalist ex physicist about it. But is the notion that there's an analogy to be drawn between the way that Lagrangian mechanics reproduces classical mechanics and the way that rights talk is useful even in a utilitarian framework, in the sense that there's nothing there's nothing about Lagrangian mechanics that we take as more real than, let's say, like Newtonian point particles or whatever. In the same way, there's nothing real about rights when we're utilitarians. It's just this useful way of speaking. Was that the sort of analogy to be drawn?
Yes, I guess I just say it goes both ways. Um, like, well, first of all, I don't know if my characterization of Lagrangian mechanics was right, because like I've done some philosophy of science courses, but I'm not a
Hmm.
physicist or anything. So I don't know if you know that was.
No. So I mean, I think the point is a good one, right? Because like in classical mechanics, typically in sort of, if you're taking an advanced mechanics course, you'll learn Lagrangian mechanics and Hamiltonian mechanics, right? Each is going to be
Right.
practical for different applications, but uh, there's no, at least physicists typically don't think that there's anything more real about the Hamiltonian formulation than the Lagrangian formulation, right? It's just going to be what's more convenient for the usage. And that I think lines up really nicely with what you were saying about sort of the usefulness of rights talk in different frameworks.
Okay, so yeah, then yeah, I guess is you you can say there's nothing more real about Lagrangian mechanics, but then I guess both formulations are equally real or unreal, right? I guess
They're on the same par. Okay.
yeah. And then so in my view, in terms of rights, and we don't have to exclusively think about utilitarianism, right? But so what is real ultimately is whatever one true correct moral principle TN exists.
Sure.
And then how you interpret that and how you go about saying which specific actions are right or wrong, etc. That's all just purely linguistic and interpretive. Like in the same way that maybe someone could argue that the principle of least action is metaphysically real because I don't know, whatever, something, and the point particles of Newtonian mechanics are not actually metaphysically real because something else, and someone could argue the opposite, right? But in the end, from within physics, you don't really care because it's also kind of, well, at least I think it's not a provable question. Which of
certainly
the two
they're empirically equivalent, right? Yeah.
Right. So yeah, so that's the central point.
Okay.
So I guess one last thing, probably Kantianism or liberalism are much more easily translatable into the language of rights. But you could probably remove rights entirely from the equation and just rewrite everything in terms of duties exclusively, and you would probably get the same thing. Just with utilitarianism, you can frame it in terms of specific acts or utility, but you could also reframe it as rights in the way that I sort of try to explain.
Jen, can I have a follow-up to that? Okay, so that leads nicely to another question that I had. So it seems like to make sense of the notion of rights, at least of the way the framing device about Noehrsvale that you were using, it seems like you need the concept of a duty to get the concept of a right off the ground, right?
Well, that's what Feinberg thinks.
Sure.
Feinberg thinks that you can't say anything is a right unless there's correlate duty from someone. Well, I guess no, I think you're probably okay. Let me restart. So Feinberg thinks there are two kinds of duties, right? General duties to do good or whatever, and then specific duty, if you owe someone money, then you have a duty to pay that person money, right? That's and then there's the correlate right from that person. Well, I have the right to the money, right? And so Feinberg thinks that's the only way that you can actually have rights. But then, for example, where I differ a little is when it comes to things so I think if, let's say, the correct moral principle says that everyone has to have a minimally decent standard of life, then, for example, you could probably say, and I'm glossing over a lot of things with this, but then that principle requires that everyone has a roof over their head, right? And so I guess you could say there's sort of diffuse social duty to provide everyone with a roof over their head rather than someone's you can't say that it's every architect and stonemason's duty to build houses for every person, right? But
Mhm.
yeah, I guess you could say there's some kind of diffuse social duty um to provide people with, a roof over their heads. And so in that sense, yeah, I guess you can say,
Mhm.
um
Yeah, and so my question was then, okay, it seems like you want to say that rights talk is useful even if utilitarianism turns out to be true,
mhm.
right? But my question is, if right requires the concept of duty, does right talk turn out to be useful in a case where externalism about reasons is true, right? So like the internalist about, or whichever one means that when you can have a duty irrespective of your particular, or you can have a reason to do X irrespective of your particular desire to do X, right? I forget whether that's internalism or externalism,
Yeah,
right?
um
So the notion being, okay, does it make sense to talk about rights and duties in a framework in which I have a reason to do something, like, because the notion of a duty requires that I have a reason to do something if I have a duty to do something, right? Irrespective of my particular proclivities or inclinations to do that, right? So the notion would be, is right talk, because I fully grant that right talk can be useful in all sorts of frameworks that don't necessarily lend themselves to right talk.
mhm.
The question is, how broad is that? Can we insert it into any moral framework?
Wait, so do you have like one specific example in mind? Because um I'm sort of fuzzy on that, area of
Yeah.
ethics.
So
So
like, yeah. So like the classic example, at least the one that I got taught in the seminar that I took on it, was sort of Bernard Williams's amoralist, right? The amoralist is this figure who recognizes, yeah, such and such is wrong, such and such is right, blah 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 blah, but he's just completely effectively inert to it. Yeah,
mhm.
yeah, it's right. I don't care. I don't want to do it. And so the challenge was, okay, does the immoralist have a reason to carry out these right and wrong actions? And some people are going to say no because he has no
No
inclination to
desire.
it.
Yeah.
But the other people, whether they're the externalists or the internalists, I can never remember, is going to say, yeah, irrespective of him not having that inclination to do so, he still has a reason to do stuff, these things, right? So the notion would be, if it seems like the notion of me having a duty to do something
Mhm.
necessarily involves me having a reason to do that thing, right? If I have a duty, I have a reason.
Oh, okay, okay.
Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense.
No, yeah. I guess it's just like I had not considered that case. And I would definitely have to think more about it. I guess like, you know, my my first reaction, and I don't know if I'm if this even goes in the direction of answering your question. Um
I mean, I'm not even sure that I have a coherent question. It's just sort of, I'm trying to
but
figure out how widely applicable this
but
this
yeah, like
framework is.
my first inclination would be to say something like, well, if you're in the camp that you still have a reason, well, like the amoralist still has a reason to do the things that are right, then I guess it makes sense, or
Yeah,
you could apply the, like, like right stock. But if not, then it's sort
yeah,
of
that's my thought too. Yeah,
yeah.
right. Okay. So that would sort of put a fence around how useful rights talk is in this way that you were talking about, right? Because like rights talk might still be useful in the utilitarian case if you're like the person who says that I can have reasons to do something irrespective of my inclinations to do it, right? But if you're the
Yeah.
kind of utilitarian who's like says, no, I have to have the internal desire to do X in order to have a reason to it, then maybe the rights talk isn't so applicable, right? So like there are different axes you can judge this on. So like I totally agree that the rights talk is useful across a vast array of different moral frameworks, irrespective of their particular ontological commitments, blah blah blah. I just wonder if the field is as open
Mhm.
as maybe at least as I understood. I could have just totally misunderstood, right? I was
Well,
just
and for example, to give you one case in which I think, or at least I'm not sure at all how would this work, and one which I did think about a little more is virtue ethics, right? Um, because in virtue ethics, you generally think of, like the right thing to do comes sort of like from uh, kind of like your own character in a way or something, right?
yeah.
Um, and so, well, where does that leave, like, the people in the receiving end of the actions, let's say, for example? So I don't know. I think that would be like a very tricky case for like my framing, for example.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, just wanted to like add that.
Okay, no, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Laura, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I find this discussion really, really fruitful, and it sort of dovetails with a lot of thinking I've been doing on this lately about, our sort of like average everyday ethical practice and interpretive frameworks like Kantianism, utilitarianism, Rawlsianism, or whatever that are basically elucidate it and sort of provide reasons for our everyday reasons. And I applaud this. This is exactly the right question to ask. My question is can the interpretive frameworks really bear the kind of justificational weight that our ordinary ethical practice places upon them, especially when it comes to rights talk? And I'm not sure about that. I mean, to lay my cards on the table, I'm pretty much a dyed-in-the-wool neo-Aristotelian. I sometimes call myself a reform McIntyrean or a left McIntyrean on ethics, if that's not too crazy. Yeah. But I mean, take for example a utilitarian interpretive framework for rights. Like rule utilitarianism. And I think in a sense, that's pretty clear that it could accommodate rights talk. Like I have a right not to be tortured for the sake of you getting political information that might serve the general welfare. Why? On a rule utilitarian framework, it's because that particular rule in the ultimate long run will secure the general welfare, a preponderance of good over evil, of pleasure over pain. But if you push this hard enough, I don't know, I think it falls down, which is, what is the utilitarian justification of, a claim that, adhering to a rule on every occasion promotes the general welfare? Why not this particular? Why not? I possess information about where a nuclear bomb is going to go off and when that will kill millions of people, and you're you're an intelligence agent who needs to get this information from me. Once you admit exceptions to the rule, the act utilitarian could say, it's. You've just admitted that rights talk is severely compromised. So why don't we just go full Bentham and say that rights talk is nonsense on stilts? I mean, I think there are all sorts of examples that you could bring to bear on that. Like I'm far more sympathetic to Kant's position than the utilitarians. But I think Hegel had a point when he said there's something to Kant's idea that morality, duty talk, sort of places restrictions on us as rational agents. But the way Kant formulates it, it's either too abstract. The universalized ability principle could, I have a right to shoot you if I don't like your political beliefs. Can you universalize that? I suppose some people could, which is part of the problem. or you go to the second formulation of the categorical imperative where he talks about treating others with respect. A Hegelian could say, well, where do you get that idea from? If you want this to be a strictly derivable from the idea of being a rational, self-determining rational agent as such. I suppose my point is, I think you're right that utilitarianism, Rawlsianism, Kantianism, any ism will serve as a good interpretive framework for this. But A, how do you judge those interpretive frameworks? And B, are they on all fours with each other when it comes to actually doing something in the practical sphere? I'm not at all sure about that. I mean, I know this is a bit of a joke, but I keep thinking of Peter Singer and, people saying, well, I'd rather be his dog. What counts as a reductio ad absurdum here? And, can a particular interpretive framework really have significant and deleterious effects on your actual practical conduct? So that's perfect question. I'm just not sure that, and I think we need interpretive frameworks. I just think some of them don't work. And how would you go about parsing that difficulty?
Well, okay, so I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but so like if I'm like going completely off the rails here, just let me know and I'll try to answer or like go in a different direction that answers your question more. But I guess, and actually, like I was thinking of starting with something like this, but then I thought it would just add too much unnecessary like context, I guess. But so I guess in the practical ground level discourse about what is right and what is wrong, like everyday either actions or policy or what have you. Like people all the time argue from like very different frameworks, and by different frameworks I don't mean like utilitarianism or Kantianism or whatever, but just like some people argue from the point of view of well, people deserve well-being, and others prefer to argue from the point of view of, well, people have certain rights and you can't infringe on those rights because whatever particular justification they may have, whether it's like human dignity or freedom or etc., right? So I guess in one sense what I'm trying to say, which I think is my answer to your question, but let me know if it's not right. It's like all these different points of views, like all these different ways of arguing are actually the same thing in some sense, because we're used to, for example, like in the context of U.S. political discourse, right? It's always like the hardcore libertarians who like really bring up like, well, I have a right to not be compelled by the government to do whatever, right? And maybe progressives argue more from a point of view of, well, everyone deserves a like decent standard of living, and so we need to provide for everyone to have like a minimal standard, right? Um, so, like, I guess my point is like, it's not that rights are in conflict with say welfareism, for example. It's just that you could make the same kinds of arguments for both sides. Like what you're ultimately arguing is not rights versus welfare, but you're arguing between one moral principle, say libertarianism, against another moral principle, say progressivism. And you could just argue both with a similar framework. Um, so in a sense, like, I guess if I want to have any contribution to like practical discourse, is to say, well, rights talk only matters if you can figure out which rights are real and which ones are not. And to figure out which rights are real and which ones are not, what you're really doing is just trying to figure out like what's the one correct moral principle. And that's like a very, very hard question that you're going to have to be, you're going to have a very hard time answering, right?
You hit the nail on the head there. I think is that when it comes to like specific moral reasons for specific actions, what you find very quickly when a democratic socialist like myself will argue with a libertarian is that we can both use rights talk, but the question is, will that get us anywhere in our discussion? I have a right to unlimited accumulation. If to use Nozick's terminology, what I have as a result of a just original acquisition. And I could say there, I don't see any right there, and we'd be arguing till we're blue, blue in the face.
Right.
So you're right about that. But I think there's another move that can be made, which is to show, as a kind of imminent critique. And this is McIntyre making himself known in my thinking, that like the libertarian standpoint fails by the libertarian's own standards, and that I can describe that and transcend that and show where the libertarian goes wrong in his conception of a right. In other words, I show why they fail on their own standards, and where I, as a kind of socialist, democratic socialist, social democrat, can sort of turn around and say, well, I can explain your failure. It's because Nozick shoots this idea of an act of just original acquisition out of a cannon. And, if you do history, there ain't no such thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, this is, it's again, I think the interplay between theory and practice. I mean, sometimes practically speaking, it doesn't make much of a difference. That if, a religious believer like myself and an atheist can both agree that, let's say, egregious acts of racial discrimination are evil, this is great. But we'll have different ways of parsing that. Maybe in the future they'll come into conflict. So far they haven't. But I mean, this is the whole idea of ethics as a practical discipline, I think, is that it's a practical discipline that banks upon inevitably some theories you have about the nature of the good, the nature of human action, the nature of rationality. And at some point, they're going to hit pay dirt in our actions. And that will be, and I mean, I think this is like the blatant problem with utilitarianism, is that like in many spheres of public life, that is what you do. You weigh the greatest good for the greatest number. But if you make that into a general principle and you don't fudge it, you're going to have serious serious problems, maybe not now when we're talking about, let's say, environmental policy, or whether to build or not build a dam for hydroelectric power. I mean, fine, utilitarianism is the way to go, probably. But I mean, at some point, that's not going to happen. Like Peter Singer and his his take on not so much animal rights, but like the rights of the disabled.
Mhm.
You see what I'm saying here is that I think you put your finger on a really, maybe the important problem now is what makes practical ethical discourse possible, which is the ability to share reasons for doing what you do. And the reasons can go down pretty far. But at some point they will diverge, and maybe that divergence doesn't make a difference. But I mean, sometimes it does. I mean, I could imagine a Peter Singer devotee saying, "Oh, what, you think that utility doesn't matter?" And I'm saying, absolutely not. It doesn't matter, but there's a stopping point where a strict devotion or adherence to the utilitarian, the Benthamite principle, is going to break down. That's what I'm saying. It's I suppose the next project for us would both be, what is the right relationship of ethical theory to everyday ethical practice. And I think it's dangerous to subordinate one to the other. I hope that makes sense.
No, yeah.
Hey, Michael, you want to chime in?
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so it's a very different question, I suppose. It seems part of your view that any moral principle can be represented in terms of rights. And I thought there are, I guess, three classes which might be hard, classes of duty someone might have, or moral principle, which might be hard to represent in terms of rights. Those being ones, the right or the duty to create certain people or not to create certain people, because the people who are going to be affected don't exist. So in population ethics, that matters. But people affected, if the victims or the people concerned don't exist, then there's no one to have the rights. Also, duties to yourself, and because it's not a claim against someone else, because it's just
so
you.
You're sort of like breaking up. Could you repeat that last part?
Duties to yourself. So some people think we have duties just to ourselves, and because that's not someone else, I can't remember whether Feinberg's formulation that you read out was specific to it being about someone else, but it's a bit weird anyway, talking about having a sort of rights claim against yourself. And the third is just where it's not a person, if it's an artwork or the environment or something like that, and there it's not a person that's the victim. So I'm not supposed to destroy, I don't know, a tree or whatever. Then you might say, well, the tree's got the rights. But if you do, so you can, I suppose, say, well, you can find something, whether it's a non-existent person or yourself or it's a tree or whatever it is, you can probably find something. But then someone might say, well, then it's not really about rights, because a right has to be, we just decided what a right was, and in particular, if it's internal to someone's view that a right is a certain kind of thing, then it isn't just, well, we all agree that there are rights, because some people mean something more specific by rights, rather than just disagreeing about. So that you'd say, well, you're saving the word, but you're changing the subject a little bit. So I wondered just sort of what kind of style of response you think you should go for to that kind of issue.
Okay, yeah, that's actually a great question. So I guess my first intuition, and this might seem a bit like a cop-out, but I hope it's not. So, for example, presumably all of those duties that you just described would be based on some like higher moral principle, right? Like if you have a duty to bring someone into the world or not to bring someone into the world, um, there's probably like there should be some higher principle that is telling you why or why not you should do those things or not do those things.
Yeah, I mean, it could be the utilitarianism that has things to say because it doesn't matter if the people don't exist. You just need the greatest aggregate happiness, and
Right,
so
exactly. So
utilitarianism is a principle that can justify those kinds of.
yeah, so in that sense, for example, well, you could maybe you can say, well, that person has a right to be born because like a person that hasn't been born yet can't have rights. I mean, I guess some people could make that case, but I would need to think a lot more about that. But I guess, yeah. So my first response would be, well, you have like the moral principle already that is giving you these duties that are difficult to reframe as rights. Um, but so I guess my point is not to like reframe every single moral dilemma that exists as a question of rights, but just to say that like what matters is the higher principle, and then once you have that, there will always be certain things that you can reframe as right stock, and then others are probably more difficult, like the ones you just laid out, right? Um, so that's one thing. Um, so in that sense, yeah, maybe those particular dilemmas you couldn't frame in terms of rights, but they come from a higher principle which has like a lot of other implications, which
Yeah.
I think will be possibly reframed as rights. And then the other thing I would say is, for example, you could also say that, for example, if you have a duty to bring people into the world or not bring people into the world, say, I guess the people on the receiving end of the actions are not just the people who are about to be born or not be born, but society at large as a whole. And so I guess you could also say, well, society in general, or humanity, or maybe your neighbor could have a claim against you. I mean, your neighbor is probably a stretch, but society maybe has a claim against you to not have a child, or to do have a child, or I guess that's one possible avenue that could be used to reframe it as rights. And then the third option, the one about like generally nature and all that, yeah, I think that would fall in the category of Feinberg's sort of like general duties, like the duties to like just do good in general. And yeah, those I don't think you can very easily reframe as rights, unless, like you said, maybe if you want to argue that trees have rights, which I don't know if that's even like a possible thing. I guess if animals can have rights, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I understand in some there are some legal systems which have made provisions on some occasions for uh, features of the natural world having rights, like mountains or rivers. I think there are mountains and rivers in the world which are legal persons, at least in some sense.
Yeah, so
But
like they can be
it's kind
defended
of
in
it's not how
court,
we
right?
usually. Yeah. Yeah. I don't really understand it. I don't know a lot about the
Yeah,
law, but I think it is something that does happen on some occasions. So that would be so. The option isn't sort of unprecedented
yeah.
or absurd in that it's you could sort of say, well, it's like this legal instrument.
Yeah, no, but I mean, just yeah, that area, that question that you brought up is certainly something that I don't yet have, fully figured out, and certainly something that I would need to address like much more in depth, I guess.
Yeah. Thanks.
Wow, that hour flew by. I don't know if other people feel the same way, but I was just like captivated the whole time. I can't believe it's 11:30 already. So please join me in thanking Nestor for this really cool coffee hour talk. Do you want to say any like closing words? You don't have to.
Actually, no, actually, yeah, it's might be a bit self-serving, but I guess this was always what I wanted to do with presenting here. So like what I presented is something that I'm thinking of kind of submitting as my proposal for like PhD applications and whatnot. So if anyone has any thoughts on this particular topic with that in mind, and would like to discuss with me further, like please do so. Because even if you say like no, this is actually like a really bad idea to use for that, and you should, like, I would rather hear that, even if it's harsh, and then try to actually, but like I want to submit something that will increase my chances of getting in, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
awesome.
so
I just want to use this opportunity then to remind everybody that Nestor's extended abstract for this proposal is on the Cartuito website. If you navigate to the page for this workshop and you click the title of his talk, you'll find it there. So.
Okay.
Cool. Actually, just in case people do plan to take you up on that offer, would you mind putting like some contact info in the chat, like maybe your email address?
Oh, sure thing. Yeah. I'll put in my email address.
Oh, and I forgot to invite people to do it last time, but feel free to also put your Twitter if you want to. That stuff, at least for our speakers, are also on the website. But if you're a participant and you also want to sort of extend the conversation into the virtual Twitter realm.
Okay, yeah. So in the chat I put my email address and my Twitter So if anyone wants to take me up on that offer, both are fine. Like Twitter DM or email, or either works.
Awesome.
So thanks everyone. I think those were very helpful comments. So.
Yeah, thanks everyone. This has been, like I said, it was a blast. Time flies when you're having fun. Okay, so feel free to stick around or go to lunch, or actually I don't know what time it is wherever you guys are. It's just about lunchtime over here in Los Angeles. We'll have this room stay open until, through the next talk. The next and last talk will be in this room. I'm going to stop the YouTube stream for anybody watching now. So see you later. Check the @Cogtuito series Twitter feed for the next YouTube streaming link for the colloquium talk, which will start at 1 p.m.